Hi, Ridgecrest readers. I am so excited to be with you as we read Ranger in Time, Race to the South Pole together. I will be reading chapters 12, Race to the South Pole, and chapter 13, No Turning Back. Finally, the days grew lighter. The men sang as they worked, getting ready for their trip to the South Pole. They stopped to pat Ranger's head and slipped him bits of pemmican. Ranger was getting used to this strange, fatty meat. It didn't taste as good as the hamburger pieces Luke dropped him under the picnic table at home, but it was meat. And any meat was better than no meat at all. When the polar party set out from Cape Evans, Ranger was with Osmond, pulling one of the sleds. The dogs were better on ice than the ponies that kept slipping and sinking into the snow. "Will the ponies be all right?" Jack asked Cherry one night. Cherry shook his head. "They're not suited for this kind of travel, and they are suffering. Captain Scott only intends to take them a bit farther," he said. "Then he'll shoot them and leave the meat behind for the dogs to eat on the return trip." "He's going to kill them?" "He can't do that. It's not right. It's survival," Cherry said quietly. "There isn't enough food. We need the meat for the dogs, and the ponies aren't going to make it anyway." So the dogs pulled some of the sleds, and the men, strapped into harnesses, hauled the rest on skis. Some days they made it only 8 or 10 miles before another blizzard chased them into their tents. One morning Jack couldn't find his goggles. Had he lost them in the snow? There was no time to look. They had to start out again. All day the sun glistened on the icy surface of the Beardmore Glacier. Jack felt as if his eyes were filled with scratchy sand that tears wouldn't wash away. Soon they were so swollen he could barely see the tips of his skis. Ranger stayed close by Jack's side and nudged him if he started drifting towards the edge of the crevice. When they stopped for the day, Cherry gave Jack tea leaves tied into cotton to press against his eyes. It soothed them a little, but it didn't soothe the scratchy feeling that had been growing all day in Jack's heart. He'd overheard Captain Scott talking, fretting over the rations. They'd planned their laying of supplies carefully so they'd have food for the entire trip to the South Pole and return. But now they were already eating food that should have been saved for the last stages of the journey. What would they eat later on? Jack's pemmican and biscuits were stuck in his throat that night. His eyes were still swollen shut, but he couldn't stop seeing images in his mind. So many miles of whiteness, so little food for the rest of the trip. But they had to reach the South Pole. They couldn't give up now. Jack was about to climb into his sleeping bag when Captain Scott stepped into their tent. "I'm afraid I have rather a blow for you," he said. "We're going back." Jack couldn't see Cherry's face, but he heard the disappointment in his voice. "I've thought long about this," Captain Scott said. "Our rations are slim. The two of you are weak from your winter journey to Cape Crozier." Jack felt Captain Scott's hand on his shoulder. "I'm sending you back to the base camp at Cape Evans, along with Atch, Cohane, and Silas, to wait for our return. You'll depart tomorrow." "No," Jack blurted. He hadn't come all this way, left his family and everything he'd ever known to turn back. "I won't go back. I can't." "You must," Captain Scott said, and with that he left the tent. Jack's eyes burned with tears. One slipped down his sunburned cheek. Jack pressed his hands into his eyes so the other men wouldn't see. That evening Cherry gave away his extra gear. He passed his finnesko on to Bowers, his pajama trousers to Wilson, his socks to Crean. Then he climbed into his sleeping bag with a sigh. Jack didn't understand how Cherry could let it go so easily. How could he come so far and not fight to stay? It was wrong. Maybe Cherry accepted Captain Scott's decision, but Jack didn't. The next day, Captain Scott and his remaining team set out to the south. Jack and Cherry and the rest of the returning party packed up their tent and started back toward Cape Evans. The journey over the Beardmore Glacier had been long and full of trouble the first time they'd made it, but that trip had been for a good reason. They'd been on their way to a place no man had stood before. Today, the trip over the glacier was every bit as dreary and exhausting. But this time Jack was making it as a failure, someone Captain Scott didn't believe was strong enough or smart enough. He wasn't enough of anything to push on to the end. Jack was exhausted. His muscles ached. He was sunburned and frostbitten and sick to his stomach. All he could do was keep marching over the ice, away from where he wanted to be. A few miles into the trip, a snowy crust gave way beneath Jack's feet. He plunged into a crevice, falling past its icy walls until the harness jerked at his middle and caught him. Ranger barked up above. "You all right there?" Cherry called down. Jack didn't answer. He wasn't all right. He was so broken, he half wished the harness would just let him go. Then he wouldn't have to walk any more miles away from his dream. But the harness held strong. Cherry and the other men pulled him up. Later, as Jack listened to the men breathing and snoring in their frozen sleeping bags, he made a decision. He wasn't taking one more step toward Cape Evans. He'd take a pack with some food and follow the sled tracks backward until he found Captain Scott and the polar team. As just one man on skis with no sled to pull, he'd catch up to them in a day, maybe less. He would sneak himself back to the team. It was no different from stowing away on the Terra Nova in Port Chalmers, really. And then Captain Scott would have no choice but to let him continue on to the South Pole. Jack eased himself out of his sleeping bag so he wouldn't wake the others. He slipped 2 rations of pemmican and biscuits into a carrying pack. He pulled on his fur boots and balaclava and headed for the tent door. Jack looked back at the shaggy golden dog curled up near Cherry's sleeping bag. He thought about calling to him in a whisper. But if Jack woke the other men, his plan would be ruined. And tonight was his only chance to rejoin the polar party. Jack had to run for his dream while it was still close enough. As quietly as he could, he stepped out of the tent. The sky was clear, the snow bright as day. The sun never set here in December. Jack strapped on his skis. He found yesterday's sled trail leading back over the glacier and started across the ice to find Captain Scott. Then they would trek on together to the South Pole. Chapter 13. No turning back. The first hours were good ones. Jack listened to the swish and crunch of his skis over the crusty snow. He followed the sled tracks over ridges, up and down the waves of the glacier. But the wind picked up. It stung Jack's eyes through the holes in his balaclava, and it did something else worse. It had snowed recently on this part of the glacier. With every push of his skis, Jack saw the sled tracks from the day before grow fainter and fainter until he couldn't see them at all. Jack turned to look behind him. It felt good to have the wind out of his face for a moment, but his relief didn't last. The tracks behind him were gone too. Jack swallowed hard. He could turn back. That would probably be best. But how would he find Cherry and the others without his tracks? At the very least, if he used his compass and kept pushing south, he'd be going in the same direction as Captain Scott. How far could he be by now? Soon Jack figured he'd come upon their campsite from the day before. The wind couldn't have wiped away every sign of it. It would be there, and not far past it would be Captain Scott. Jack tried to convince himself of that as he pressed on, but the wind was telling other stories. Whistling and howling, the glacier was no place to be alone. Ranger was dreaming of bacon when Cherry rolled over onto his paw. Ranger yelped awake. "Sorry there, fella," Cherry said as he wiggled out of his icy sleeping bag to begin the day. Ranger rested his nose on his paws and tried to go back to sleep. He loved bacon. The home bacon that Luke's dad cooked with waffles on Sunday mornings. In his dream, it had been sizzling in the frying pan. Luke and Sadie were in the kitchen with him, slipping him pieces under the table, the way Jack gave him tastes of pemmican sometimes. Ranger liked Jack a lot, but he missed Luke, and bacon was so much better than pemmican. Ranger gave up on sleeping and looked around the tent. Where was Jack? The boy's sleeping bag was still there, all frozen up and stiff like he got out of it a long time ago. Ranger sniffed the bag. It still smelled like Jack. He sniffed it again and barked. "What is it, dog?" Cherry looked over from the corner where he was trying to light their tiny portable stove. Then he looked past Ranger to Jack's empty sleeping bag. "Where'd your boy go? Outside to relieve himself?" He frowned, walked to the tent door, and looked outside. Then he called back to the other men. Anybody hear Jack get up this morning? They hadn't. Cherry sighed. He's just brave enough and just fool enough to have gone out looking for Scott. Cherry put on his outer trousers and jacket, his boots and balaclava and fur mitts. He turned to Ranger. Come on, dog, let's go look for him. Jack kept on going. He skied up and down the waves of the glacier. He tried to travel in a straight line, but it was impossible. The sled tracks were long gone, even though it wasn't as snowy here. He wondered how far off course he was. Jack wanted to take a rest, to eat something and check on the compass reading, but he was afraid that even the shortest break would let Captain Scott get farther away. And he had to catch up, soon. The food and water on his back wouldn't last more than a day. If he didn't find Scott soon, he wouldn't have shelter either. Jack skied faster, as if he could outrun his thoughts. But there was no getting away from the cold reality of his decision. If he didn't find Scott quickly, he would die out here on the glacier. He wouldn't go home a hero. He wouldn't go home at all. His mother and brothers would never get the help he set out to give them. Today, out on the ice, the idea of going home without reaching the South Pole didn't seem like the worst thing in the world. It seemed like Jack's best hope, but the farther he skied, the more that hope faded. The sun moved across the sky and Jack skied on. There was no sign of sled tracks, no sign of Scott, nothing but ice and snow. Jack knew he couldn't afford to stop, not even for a few minutes, but he had to know if he was still going the right way. Jack held his poles in one hand and used his teeth to pull off his other mitt. He ignored the icy burn of the wind, reached behind his pack to unbuckle it, and fumbled with frozen fingers until he found the compass. Then his right foot broke through a crust of snow. In a heartbeat, Jack found himself clinging to the edge of a crevice. His one mitt slipped as he tried to hold on. With his other hand red and raw and exposed, Jack clawed at the ice, trying to pull himself up. His ski dangled and flailed over the icy darkness below. Every time he tried to pull himself up, the crumbling snow gave way. Jack slipped closer and closer to the edge. His fingers on his exposed hand were scratched and bleeding, but he couldn't feel them anymore. He could only watch as they slipped closer and closer to the edge. Jack knew he couldn't hold on forever. He summoned all of his strength and tried to heave himself up. He was almost there when the edge of the ice broke off. Jack's stomach rose into his throat. The ice walls rushed past as he fell. One of his skis caught in the ice. Jack's leg twisted and his knee gave a sickening pop. Then the ski was gone and he was falling again. Just when it felt like he might plunge into the darkness forever, Jack thumped on his back onto a snow shelf. He landed so hard he couldn't breathe. Finally, he sucked in a great gasp of air and then another. Jack's knee throbbed with pain. His heart pounded in his chest as he lay on the hard-packed snow. How far had he fallen? Jack was afraid to look. He was afraid to move. He knew he was lucky to be alive. The snow shelf had saved him. But then Jack looked up. The light of the polar sky was far, far above him. The icy walls of the crevice were smooth and slippery, with nothing that even resembled a foothold. He was trapped. The snow shelf hadn't saved his life. It might only have delayed his death. Here's our last picture in that chapter. I can't wait to see how our book finishes, as Mr. Bitter will be joining you for the last chapters. Thanks, Ridgecrest.